Good afternoon, everybody. On behalf of the North Carolina Chamber, welcome to our Ag Allies webinar, ESG 101 and why it matters to agribusiness. We know that you have lots of things you could be doing with your time, and we appreciate you joining us here today. All attendees have been muted, so the way you'll communicate with us is if you have a question for our panelists, please put that in the Q&A box. If you need to chat with other participants in the program, feel free to do that over in the chat box. We will record the webinar, and then you'll receive that on the email within a couple of days as we head into the weekend. So with that, before I introduce our two speakers, I want to do a little bit of stage setting for this topic, lest you believe that ESG, whatever that means, because we're about to learn that, is not important to agriculture or does not have a way of getting some of its tentacles into your agribusiness or even down to your farming operation. Let me share a couple of observations. Pulled directly from the internet, very easy to find. This one from a Forbes article printed in the last couple of weeks. In the modern internet age of unlimited information and transparency, labeling something as ESG related without backing up the results no longer sits well with investors. In recent years, the industry has been ridiculed for greenwashing, and investors have begun demanding more valuable insights into whether companies are actually moving the needle on ESG principles. Investors want concrete answers about exactly how companies are reducing their carbon footprint and improving diverse and inclusive hiring practices, for example. That's coming to an agribusiness or a farm near you. This one from another company who actually markets their service as a company that can help you navigate ESG. I think this one is particularly for us. ESG risk permeate the agricultural supply chain, from deforestation to child labor to unfair labor remuneration. Companies that source from downstream suppliers are at risk. So notice what's happening here. This is an outside company looking to advise a non-ag company on how they need to interact with their agricultural suppliers. And it's not really complimentary things that they have to say about our industry. And then a giant US agribusiness that formerly had a lot of presence here in the Triangle, but doesn't anymore. Here's what they had to say, quote, "Securing a sufficient supply of quality food is just one side of the coin." That's what we talk about a lot in agriculture. Look at the job we're doing. Look at what we're providing. Look at what we're laying out for folks to be able to eat inexpensively and safely every day at a high quality product. But this agribusiness giant says that's only one side of the coin. They continue, agriculture needs to meet these growing demands by using natural resources more efficiently and more responsibly. So these comments, Marissa, are not really complimentary. That they make me a little bit nervous. I thought all this ESG stuff was supposed to be good. And now I'm sort of worried about this movement that I don't even know a lot about. And that's exactly why we asked Marissa and Kevin to help us navigate some of this today. So I'm going to introduce both of our speakers, then we'll turn them loose to walk through their presentations. And of course, then we'll have some of that Q&A time. Marissa is beaming in all the way from Seattle. Now, K&L Gates, her employer, her law firm, has an office here in Raleigh. And in fact, they're very good friends with the chamber. Our good friend Margaret Westbrook and Nathan Huff and Matthew Houston are over there. In fact, Matthew, Marissa, I don't know if you know this, he's actually engaged in a cattle farm. He actually has some of his own cows out in eastern North Carolina. I first met Marissa and got to know her a little bit through the American Agricultural Law Association, and I appreciate her engagement in that. She has a good deal of agriculture and agribusiness clients and has done a lot of work in that space across the United States. But is really, I would say, the reason she's here is because she's really been a leader in educating folks in the ag space about what ESG is and what it could mean to our industry. So Marissa, we look forward to you playing that role for us here in a minute, and we're all ears. Kevin, if folks looked at your resume, they may have said, wait a minute, why is a guy with experience defending securities claims, why would he be on an ag webinar? He's formerly with the Department of Justice. He's formerly a part of the enforcement team at the Securities and Exchange Commission. He teaches this stuff at Georgetown. What could he possibly have to say to a bunch of Aggies and agribusiness folks? Well, I think the role that Kevin will play later today is he knows better than anyone where the future of these enforcement efforts are headed. Kevin, we say a lot of times in the ag space that the market is our biggest regulator. I'm going to see if you agree with that in a few minutes. The market is certainly regulating through ESG, but it sounds like to me the regulators are pretty excited about regulating too. So we'll be interested in hearing what you say about that and whether you respectfully disagree or not. But with that said, I've said enough. Let me remind you that at any time you're welcome to put a question in the Q&A box. We're glad you're with us, and we're certainly glad these two experts are with us. So Marissa, you have the floor. Thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thank you so much, Ray. And I appreciate very much the opportunity to speak. This is a wonderful opportunity, and thank you. So just to get started here, let's go into the next slide. So just at the very outset, ESG, it's obviously 3 letters. What does it stand for? Environmental, social, and governance. And if you hear ESG, I was talking just the other week with someone who is very well versed in investment of real estate, and she said, now the S stands for sustainable, right? So these words are still being learned, so to speak. They're still part of the growing vernacular as we speak about investments, as we speak about operations, as companies start to investigate ways that they interact with the world. And we're going to explore each of these E, S, and G components as part of this conversation. Next slide, please. So what is ESG and how did this really come about? In part, it came out of risk underwriting from an investment criteria perspective, and we'll talk a little bit further as to some of the other stakeholders, but in large part, it came out from the concept that these various factors, E, S, G, environmental, social, governance, create a form of risk profile or risk mitigation profile. The idea being, can you future-proof a company by thinking through things that might not yet be present as a risk or danger today, but if left to their own course or left just unchecked, could create a risk to the sustainability and long-term goals of a given corporation. So from an investment perspective, you can imagine if someone's looking to underwrite a company or think through a given sector, looking at various risk components and saying, what are they doing to mitigate these various risk components is an indicator of the long-term sustainability and health of that given company or sector. So that's where a lot of this came from, and these conversations are driven from that risk mitigation, kind of look beyond the horizon, future-proof kind of concepts. Next slide, please. So farming, agribusiness, et cetera, there are obviously other examples that we can look at in terms of ways that people think about ESG in different sectors. It's not very uncommon to think about ESG and renewable energy, ESG, water and wetlands, and now we're talking here about ESG and agribusiness. These activities, they put kind of a heavy emphasis on the E. And so in terms of thinking through various companies and various sectors, if someone says, what is an ESG heavy sector that might have various risks, but also various mitigation efforts, well, it's very easy to think about renewables, wetland, agribusiness. Other examples one could throw out, obviously, are timber, mining. These are all companies that have very strong interactions with the environmental world and with potential risks that both could affect long-term profitability and sustainability of a company, that give opportunities for that company to say, what can we do today that will solve a problem that could arise down the road? And in that sense, what sustainability metrics could be taken care of now? There are other companies that one might think have more of an S emphasis. And so an example of that might be a social media company. What are they doing to protect their stakeholders, their customers, their investors, with respect to changing technologies? For example, data privacy. Are they taking care of the data that they receive from their customers? That's an example of a company. If someone was to underwrite the risk criteria, would say, look, they may not have as much of an E footprint, although one could argue that's a different argument, right? The clouds, the servers, all the data energy they're using. But let's just focus again on what a customer might think about. They might say, well, look at the S component. What are they doing to mitigate risk in terms of data management? That is a risk profile analysis. ESG is a tool for looking at that company, looking at that sector and saying, what are they doing to keep themselves either today or tomorrow at a lower risk profile? Next slide, please. So where are these ESG pressures coming from? And as Ray was saying, it's pretty much nowadays you throw a rock and you hit a newspaper article that has ESG in it. Where is this coming from? These demand parties are really coming from a whole host of players, whether it's the customers, as I've mentioned, the investors, as I've mentioned, regulators, et cetera. There are many people with desires to see risk mitigation for long-term sustainability. And often these demand parties present in combination. For example, Kraft Heinz recently stated a goal to purchase 100% sustainability sourced tomatoes for its Heinz ketchup. This goal is likely driven by a host of factors, including client demand and risk mitigation as identified by an ESG analysis. The next question raised by this goal: how will Heinz track and confirm the sustainability of its tomato sourcing? This is an example of how a sustainability goal of a downstream buyer impacts the sustainability actions of an upstream producer. Next slide, please. So how do we talk about sustainability when it comes to agriculture? And I'm sure many of you in the room are saying, well, we're already sustainable. If we don't take care of our farm, then our farm's not going to take care of us. That's part and parcel of this package of what we do. I appreciate that. And I understand that a good amount of what you do today is already sustainable. But what do we do to demonstrate that sustainability to third parties who may not understand the agricultural sector? Next slide, please. So let's talk about environmental. Some of the practical implications as it might affect a farm operator. First, I'd like to note that farm lenders take this ESG criteria into account when underwriting loans. As noted by McKinsey, companies that perform poorly in ESG criteria are more likely, in their opinion, to encounter and have to address materially adverse events. These events are, in theory, likely to create financial stress for a company. Similarly, MetLife just announced that it is now underwriting water risk as part of a sustainability analysis for farm loans in California, Oregon, and Washington. Another example of an environmental matter. Consider that the EPA calculated that the agricultural sector contributed approximately 10% of total greenhouse gases back in 2017. This gets people thinking about carbon emission and ways the agricultural sector can help with carbon sequestration. This conversation about carbon is just getting started. And in large part, it's driven by a desire to address the E emphasis of an ESG risk analysis. Next slide, please. So regarding social, let's consider the various stakeholders affected by agriculture. The owner of the farm, the operator of the farm, who may be different from the owner, the customers and consumers of agricultural products, the investors or financial institutions that have interest in farmland and the farming company itself, and the larger farming community in which the farm operation exists. Some examples of ESG matters in agriculture that impact the social segment include rural broadband and community access to resources. What are farm owners and operators doing to invest in their communities? Another example, with COVID-19 challenges, how did a processor or packer take care of their employees to help keep them safe while they continue their critical work to feed our country? How will they take care of their workers in the next pandemic or the next critical work environment? What did they learn from their COVID work environment? These are all questions. So you can see where the E and the S can also combine. For example, how does an operator take care to protect farm workers from unhealthy pesticide and chemical exposure? The various stakeholders evaluate a company by asking these and other types of questions. And I'll just put a little note out there. For those of you who are looking at headlines as it relates to staffing concerns and supply chain labor concerns, employees are looking at employers and asking these same questions as well. Next slide, please. The G in governance has been likened to the moral compass of a company. Does the company, through its ownership and management actions, take the opportunity to engage with the world in a sustainable and ethical manner while balancing the needs for profit and growth? If the E and the S are external facing, how does a company interact with the planet and the people? The G is internal facing. How does a company choose its priorities, goals, and long-term growth strategy in a way to mitigate and address long-term risk? To, in essence, future-proof the company for issues that might be lurking beyond the corner. Next slide, please. This is not to say that the agriculture sector isn't already doing things that meet ESG criteria. For example, Farmer Mac estimates that 1 in 15 farms generated some form of renewable energy. The question may be instead, is the agricultural sector getting credit for the work it's already doing? Separately, is the agricultural sector part of the conversation in determining how credit is recognized? Next slide, please. So these are some examples of how ESG, pardon me, ESG could affect you when you're, I'm sorry, I'm having a moment here. Let me just take a quick water break. No one has ever accused me of not being able to speak, so we just had example of that. So how does this shift affect me? Are your assets at risk, and are your assets making a difference? So these are the sort of questions that when you're evaluating, let's say evaluating to purchase a piece of property for farmland. Are you in a situation where that property is nearby a flood zone or wildfire zone? Is your water secure? Remember, I mentioned that MetLife is now, as part of its underwriting criteria, specifically looking at water security. Separately, the question about whether your assets are making a difference. Go back to the question about carbon sequestration. Are there ways that you can, through carbon sequestration process, eliminate or mitigate some of the carbon emissions that might be coming from your operations? The question about additionality, next slide, please. Question about additionality, I'm going to just touch on this very briefly. There are certain states, California, for example, that have very extensive credit components for various additional factors that one can add to your farm operations. For example, credits with respect to manure operations and carbon sequestration. I'm not going to get into that on this slide. It's a little bit too deep of a touch topic, but the point of the matter is various states and federal and state legislative opportunities exist for these various credits to add additionality. And this is a way that someone can take a ESG approach to get certain credits and benefit their company. Next slide, please. So let's talk about lease relationships. This is an area that I spend a lot of time in. So another example of something that comes up on a day-to-day basis that impacts ESG in an operator's perspective. Let's say an operator doesn't own the property, they're leasing it from a third party. Both of those parties, when they meet at the lease, that in essence have a handshake, they may have various ESG criteria as to how they view and see risk and how they view and see mitigation opportunities through this ESG lens. How do you, as a tenant, negotiate with a landlord who says, I want you to do X, Y, Z as part of your operations to fulfill my ESG criteria? The tenant might say, that's fine, but I also have my own operational ESG criteria, and they have me doing A, B, C. And so part of the lease negotiations, beyond the traditional, what am I going to pay for rent and what can I do on the farm, may include discussion over these ESG topics. Next slide, please. Supply chains. This is, again, that Kraft example with the Heinz ketchup that I mentioned earlier. Downstream packagers, processors, food companies, et cetera, all are creating their own ESG criteria if they haven't already. I mean, the big ones have long published them and are actually well on their way to promoting the various goals that with respect to those ESG statements. And that's part of what Kevin's going to speak about shortly. But the question here is, who determines these various terms for ESG and what are we going to be serving to? For example, if I am growing those tomatoes in my Heinz ketchup example, How do I know that I am meeting the sustainability goals that Kraft has set forth? Well, Kraft is going to give me a checklist, or they're going to say, you need to confirm to me that you have sourced your labor ethically. And that if you have, for example, guest worker visas, that the labor that you've sourced from other countries came from an ethical source. Separately, are you giving your employees work breaks? What are you doing to mitigate exposure to pesticides? That's an example. Are you taking opportunities to monitor and test your water such that we make sure that from an offtake perspective, your water is in good condition? These are all things that, again, that checklist might incur. Now, separately, let's say I'm going to grow some tomatoes and sell them to Kroger's or Whole Foods or Costco, Walmart. All of them have their own separate checklists, and those are all growing tools that a farm operator would have to grow into in order to sell as a condition of sale to that downstream purchaser of those tomatoes. As you can imagine, these sort of things are different from company to company. And that means from a grower's perspective, knowing upfront what you are growing into in terms of the various metrics and obligations, it's necessary to understand that upfront. And as farmers and producers and operators start to have more of a voice at the ESG table to determine what these credits and what these ESG metrics look like, they start taking that conversation from some of the downstream and start moving it upstream and saying, look, this is what I plan to do. And these are the outcomes that I intend to have on my farm. And those will satisfy my ESG criteria. So I guess what I'd like to leave you with on this slide, because I know we're going to step now into Kevin's portion of the presentation, is that ESG and the metrics and the different ways people are measuring the risk analysis through this ESG lens is all part of a conversation. It's a dialogue that's evolving. And part of the importance is that those who are in the agricultural sector have a seat at the table so that they have input as to how these ESG lenses are applied to their operations. Thank you. Next slide.
Well, thanks, Marissa. That was great. I really appreciate the setting the stage for what we're going to talk about. As Ray mentioned at the beginning, I spent some time at the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and then at the Department of Justice in the prosecuting securities fraud claims cases against people, insider trading, market manipulation, things like that. And ESG wasn't something that in that 12, 15 years I was doing that, we really talked about that much. But today, and as Marissa points out, it's a real live issue, and it's in this space, in my world, the sort of SEC world, it's the rapidity at which the stuff's coming is really unbelievable. Right now we're looking at proposed rules that the SEC has put out, and I think comments are due in about a month on greenhouse gas and climate risk, and we'll talk a little bit about that. As I was sitting here listening to Marissa, the Wall Street Journal just put out an article on investment advisors and funds and the new rules there and what ESG means for those folks. And all of that, I think, matters in a couple ways that we'll walk through. Matters to people in the ag space, because like any industry where you produce a product, whether you're a public company or not, your product is probably bought by public companies, as Marissa was pointing out, in the supply chain. And those public companies are going to be requiring certain things from you or wanting to know certain things from you so they can do their ESG disclosures or their climate disclosures. And so being cognizant of all this, I think, matters even if you're not a public company. It also matters if you're not a public company because you might take investments from investment funds who also are going to have these ESG rules. And then again, you might also just be a public company and then you have disclosure obligations to deal with anyway. So why don't we go on to the next slide? Next slide, please. There we go. All right. So that's the chairman of the SEC. Oh, no, back up one. Sorry, I said it twice. That's the chairman of the SEC, Gary Gensler. And this is his press release on the new climate risk disclosures. So these proposed rules came out on March 21st. People screamed bloody murder because the commission was trying to get comments in within a month, I think, and so they recently expanded the time for comments. The focus of the commission in this space is on what matters to investors, what we call materiality. And the commission has, I think, probably rightfully determined that ESG and climate issues really matter to investors. Just like Marissa was talking about earlier, that in almost all areas of business, people are starting to say, well, how can I show that I'm that I'm socially responsible or environmentally responsible? And the more people say it, the more it matters to investors. We're going to talk about that with one of the cases in a little bit. But in the proposed rule, it's enormous. It's 500 pages long. I obviously I'm not going to go through the whole thing here. I don't think anyone's gone through the whole thing really, but it mentions agriculture a few times. Just by searching the rule, you can see where it comes up a few times. It talks about water use, and the focus, as I think Ray mentioned in the beginning, is on risk, right? How does this affect your business? And so one of the questions that's posed in the rule is, how is an agricultural business going to deal with risk related to water use? And are you going to be engaging in bioengineering techniques to make the crops more resilient and less water dependent? And if that's a consideration for your business and you're a public company, you're going to have to disclose how you're addressing that. Greenhouse emissions obviously are another one, and how are you addressing risk related to greenhouse emissions? And so that's all. It's all part of the proposed rule. I would encourage anyone that to read the rule or read the summary. Certainly, the law firm summaries are a good place to start, and comment on them. And I think this is really important for any industry, but especially one that deals so much with these issues, such as the ag industry, to comment and consider submitting comments to the SEC so they get your viewpoint. Next slide, please. So this is Commissioner Pierce, and she's in here because she objected vociferously to these rules. And I think she has the view that a lot of people have about these rules. I like that she said, we're not the Securities and Environment Commission, at least not yet. And the big concern, and I think it's valid, is that this is taking the SEC outside of its realm of expertise, right? It knows securities, it knows materiality, and to be policing things like greenhouse gas disclosures really is something they're not designed to do. Just as an aside, just a few weeks ago, there were comments due on cyber. They're doing the same thing there. So the commission is taking a really broad view of its mandate of investor protection, but they're taking it very seriously. And when we look at some of the cases and some of the things they've done in the last year, you'll see what I'm talking about. But what she's concerned about, and I think she's rightfully concerned about, is we're going to have a situation where, in order to comply with these rules, I think Marissa mentioned it actually already, there are consultants, there are people out there already, there's already an industry growing to get you to comply with these proposed rules. And in some cases, they're going to be mandated audits if you're a public company of some of this stuff. And that's a really sort of scary and expensive proposition, I think, for small businesses. So that's another reason why I think it's important to both understand what's going on, with the commission, but also to participate in the process to the extent you're able to. So next slide, please. All right. So again, I can't emphasize enough how this is literally, if you read the Wall Street Journal, if you read the financial press, this is an everyday thing that's going on, is the talk about what this rule is going to mean. This is a headline from the Wall Street Journal just the other day. Fight brews over cost of SEC climate change rules. The SEC itself estimates that for small entities, small reporting companies, the cost is going to be close to $500,000 a year to comply with the new reporting requirements. That is an extraordinary amount of money to a lot of businesses. Whether that keeps people from going public and raising money in the public markets, I don't know. I think with like all government estimates of what their regulations are going to cost, my guess is that's an underestimate. But I guess that remains to be seen. And then one of the charts that I thought was interesting that they had in the proposed rule was the SEC did an analysis of public company filings by industry. And as you can see, agriculture, they looked at the public company agricultural related filings. And I think it came out to about 34% currently mentioned some sort of climate related keyword. So greenhouse gas, water, things that are falling in this bucket. And that's on the low end of the industries they looked at. And what that tells me is a couple things. One, it means these proposed rules are going to have an effect on public companies in your space, but also private entities, and we'll get to that in a second. But that there is a lot of room for growth, both in demonstrating what the industry is doing right, as Marissa was pointing out, but also in there's going to be a lot of catch up if it's not thought through. And again, this could be expensive if you're sort of scrambling to do it once the rules come out. So next slide, please. All right, so the SEC, as part of their ESG push, recently created a task force. If you follow government at all, you know that the government doesn't create a task force unless it's going to prosecute someone. And that can be DOJ, SEC, the CFTC, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. Anytime they create one of these things, there's going to be entities and individuals prosecuted. That's just the way these things work in Washington, at least. And that's only one of the things they've done. They've created a whole new what they're calling an all-agency push to examine ESG issues. So it's not only climate disclosures, it's investment funds. I think I mentioned that earlier. It's board governance, which is part of the ESG part of this. Are boards properly disclosing their expertise on environmental issues? So they create this task force. They're calling it the ESG task force in the enforcement division. They're the folks where I used to work that bring SEC securities fraud cases. So they create this task force, and not surprisingly, a year later we have this first, what they call their first big ESG case, involving a Brazilian dam, a Brazilian iron ore mining outfit called Vale, that has really large operations in Brazil. And it's a massive 285 count or 285 paragraph complaint, talking about the damage that was done by this dam collapse, which admittedly or allegedly killed 270 people, and did substantial damage. But what was really interesting about this case and a plaintiff's action case is how the commission took the Vale's public statements following an earlier disaster and used those statements against them. And what I mean by that is, after this 2015 dam collapse, the Brazilian authorities made Vale do certain things, take certain steps to protect the environment and protect its workers. And they committed to do that. And then they also did something that, I think we all do. Law firms do it. Certainly businesses do it. We all talk about sustainability and safety. We put out these reports. We do it for DEI too, which I think is all going to be folded into the ESG thing. About all the things we're doing and all the good we're doing. And I think that's a valuable exercise. But what happened here was, at least in the SEC's telling of the story, is that what they said they were doing, they weren't actually doing. And they said it. They said that they were committed to safety, and they had all these audits. And the SEC alleges that the audits were rigged and that the dams weren't actually safe, and Vale knew it. And it's not just your typical, they said something that was false. It's more a couple things. One, it's the things that they omitted, right? It's they knew the dams were not safe, or they knew that the audits were rigged, and they said they were safe and good audits anyway. But what the SEC did, and what the private plaintiffs in an earlier lawsuit did, was they looked at these non-SEC filings, so things that you might put out even if you're not a public company, like a sustainability report that said, oh, these are the things we're doing. They even pointed to a webinar that Vale did talking about all the good they were doing. And then the SEC and the plaintiff's lawsuit, they did the same thing, sort of take that stuff apart and say, yeah, that was all false. Well, okay, and you might say, well, what does that matter if it's not in an SEC filing? Well, the answer is it matters because investors rely on that stuff. And pause for a second here, because we're talking about with Vale, a public company. It trades, it trades in the United States, even though it's a Brazilian company. But why it might matter to you and why it might matter to a non-public entity, even if you're not traded, is this stuff all flows up to the public companies that are buying the products, right? And so if you're saying great things about your commitment to the environment and you're not able to back that stuff up, if you're not able to, if you don't have the metrics, or if you don't, you actually aren't doing what you're saying, and that somehow gets into some public companies' filings because they commit to only buy from ESG compliant suppliers, as Marissa was talking about, then I think you might have a problem even as a private entity. And so it's really important, and I think this is something that I take away from this case. It's really important that, even if it's not in an SEC filing, people are really thinking about, the accuracy of what maybe their PR arm is saying that's not, being run through their securities people. Because, those things have to mesh, and you're going to be measured not just on what you say as a public company in your SEC filings, but on what you're doing and saying publicly about this, because it's just such a focus. And the SEC, I can tell you, as someone who defends these cases now, takes a very broad brush of its authority and of what the facts are. So you really want to make sure, this is the way we teach compliance for public companies, but for private entities too. You really want to make sure you can back up what you're saying in this space, because it's such a big focus of what they're doing. So next slide, please. This is just the press release, and this goes through some of the things I mentioned. I won't reiterate it, but the focus on the sustainability reports that are not required filings really sort of struck me here. As the director of enforcement said in the quote, many investors rely on these disclosures, like those contained in annual sustainability reports and other public filings, to make informed investment decisions. And this is the thing that I think stuck out to me too. By allegedly manipulating those disclosures, Vale compounded the social and environmental harm caused by the Brumadinho Dam's tragic collapse. To me, this is what Commissioner Pierce was talking about, right? This is exactly what she's talking about. The SEC has no business and shouldn't be talking about whether someone has caused social and environmental harm, right? But their position is going to be, and the enforcement division's position is going to be, that by doing that, you've hurt investors, because they're sort of taking the broad view of what this all means. And it's gonna put a lot of people in harm's way with the SEC, who really didn't think that what they were doing was related to any sort of securities issues. So just another reason to be careful in what you're saying about what you're doing if you in any way touch the public markets. Next slide, please. The class action complaint. I mentioned this earlier. They beat the SEC by about 2 years in filing this complaint. But what's interesting about that is, because it's a class action complaint that preceded the SEC by a couple of years, there's been some litigation already. And what the judge in that case that denied a motion to dismiss said was, well, maybe if you just talk about this stuff once, it's not material to an investor. But if you keep saying it, eventually people start to rely on it. So when statements are made repeatedly in an effort to reinsure the investing public, those statements may become material. So what we would normally call puffery, what we would normally say, that's just a forward-looking statement. That's just something that, we aspire to be environmentally friendly. But if you say it over and over and you really aren't doing it, then that suddenly becomes a fraud. And I think, again, that sort of is why people really need to be careful what they're saying publicly, even in their non-securities filings. Next slide, please. And so, again, just to tell you just how crazy this space is. So what's today, the 25th? So 2 days ago, the SEC did their second ESG task force case. So this is, we're talking about within a span of a month, 2 major cases. We started on these slides, and I had to add this in just yesterday because this case came down. But here's another example. An investment advisor said it was going to be investing in only certain ESG things, and said it was going to have all of the things it invested in go through an ESG quality review. And I don't really know what that means, and I guess that's self-defined by BNY Mellon, but turned out they weren't doing it. And they ended up paying $1.5 million to settle this case with the SEC. But this is another case where it's, I talk about, and I always advise people, you got to have metrics if you're going to talk about things like this. If you're going to say you're doing something or say you're compliant with something, have the metrics to back it up. Well, here, what's really interesting is the whole pitch here was that they did have the metrics and they just didn't apply them. So, it's like any other sort of risk and compliance program in your whatever industry you're in. If you don't test the program, and if you're not using it, it's what we call a paper program and not very good. And here the SEC made BNY Mellon pay for that. So next slide, please. Just a couple other things to hit on. As I mentioned, not only is the enforcement division on this, but what's called the Division of Examinations. And they're the ones that go into all the investment advisors and all the funds, where you have your retirement plans and things like that, and examine them. And Ray mentioned greenwashing at the very beginning. I mean, this is a big issue with the SEC right now. If you say you're a green fund or you say you're environmentally responsible and you're really not, that's called greenwashing. As an aside, I might accuse the SEC of a little greenwashing of their own. If you look at their webpage, most of the cases that they list as being related to ESG really aren't. But that's a personal bone I have to pick with them. But anyway, so it's an important thing for the Division of Examinations. This is part of that all agency approach I mentioned. And then for the Division of Enforcement, the ones that actually go out and sue people for violating these things and investigate people, they've put senior people in charge of it. And one aside on this that I think it's important to understand, and look, this is what I do for a living, is defend people in these investigations. You may never have done anything wrong. You may not be a public company, but that doesn't mean the SEC can't send you a subpoena and make your employees and your officers sit down for SEC testimony if you're part of the flow of information to the public in public companies. And so that's why it's really important, again, to make sure we're all thinking about this from the context, from the sort of the securities world point of view, because even if you're not a public company, the SEC can still issue you a subpoena and you can still be subject to a costly investigation. So the best defense to that is, if you're in a space where you're going to be dealing with ESG issues or with selling to a public company that has ESG disclosures, making sure you have your ducks in a row on the front end and know kind of what they're expecting of you and what they're saying, so that if you do get that subpoena, you can say, hey, we told them exactly everything we said was true, and this is easy. Let me just let me send you what we sent them, and you can see we're the good guys here trying to do the right thing. All right, so next slide, please. So I threw this one in here just to make a little point. Elon Musk had a Twitter fit the other day about this because Tesla was thrown off the S&P 500 ESG list. And his point is, we make battery operated cars. How could we not be ESG when a oil producer, like I think he was talking about Exxon, is on the ESG list? And the S&P responded with a whole statement about why that is and why they made these decisions. The point here is not that whether Musk is right or S&P is right. The point is what ESG means, and I think Marissa talked about this at the beginning, is really evolving, and it's sort of in the eye of the beholder. This brings me back to the point, though, that as long as your actions match your words, you're in a really much better place. Because what the S&P said about Tesla is, well, sure, you have battery operated cars, but you fail on all these other things. You fail on governance, and you fail on other types of emissions, and some sexual harassment stuff, I think, was something else they said in there. Check the S&P statement. But the point is, it's hard to say what this means now. And so the safest thing to do is make sure that when you're talking about anything that could be part of this space, you can back up what you're saying with actual actions and actual data. Next slide, please. So takeaways, I think I've covered all these, so I think I'm at my time, so I won't go too much longer, but it really is an evolving concept, and just metrics and being able to document what you're saying is accurate is really important to being able to defend these cases and cut down on investigation costs. It may be that you didn't do anything wrong, but you certainly don't want to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars explaining that to the SEC if you don't have to. Well, Ray, Marissa, thank you very much for the opportunity. I hope that was helpful.
Very helpful. Thanks, Marissa, for setting the stage. Kevin, for kind of coming behind and talking about what may be next in the regulatory space. I would invite you both to turn your microphones back on and let's just have a quick conversation based on some of these questions we've gotten. A couple from our friend Jenna Lansing at Aimpoint, and I think it's right over the target. I mean, what she's asking is exactly what I hear folks in the kind of downstream ag space asking each other, and that is, hey, look, I'm a private company. I may be a small grain dealer. I may just be a large farmer. I'm not making any claims about ESG. I'm not making any guarantees about how my crop was grown. Do I have anything to worry about? I mean, I guess just a very practical question. I know this, maybe the question is, I know this is a big deal for some people, but I'm not making any claims. I'm not saying anything special about how I'm growing my crop. I have the best technology. I do a good job protecting the environment. I'm a responsible agribusiness, but you want to react to that? Marissa, maybe jump in first and we'll let Kevin catch his breath. But what does it mean to folks that aren't really on the train?
Yeah, I think what I would advise here is that there's a difference between necessarily having these ESG statements and putting them on your website and all of the disclosure issues that Kevin's talking about. And then there's the practical reality that if you are in a supply chain industry like agribusiness, that at some point, unless you own your dirt yourself, never have any financing with anybody else, you have zero emissions to go to your neighbor, no water goes off of your property, and you eat all the crop yourself. In other words, you are solely self-contained. And nobody else is going to rely on, statements about your sustainability or how you operated as such to fulfill their own criteria, their own checkbox. Then there might be an argument this could literally pass you over. But even in that scenario, if the time comes for you to go to sell your farm and your grain operation or your grain, conditioning plant or whatever it is you might do, you're going to find that most buyers will have some of these same questions, and their reps and warranties and their purchase and sale agreement will come to some of these same questions because they answer to their stakeholders, whether it's their customers, their internal employees, internal brass, or their investors. Basically, the universe in which they live drives their investment decisions, which drives their due diligence inquiries. So it's in my experience, and it's pretty hard. You might find that you just have to satisfy a few check boxes with respect to those tomatoes that I mentioned in my earlier example, and that might be the sole degree to which you interact with it. But I do think it's important that you're aware that this is out there. That's my initial take on it. Kevin, what are your thoughts?
No, I think that's precisely right. I think that if I'm advising, let's start with BlackRock, right? They're one of the big ESG funds, right? And if they're investing in Kroger and are going to demand that Kroger tell them about the sourcing of their products, that's where, as a private company, you might be asked this in the supply chain. And so I think you're not going to be able to escape eventually it's going to come down to everyone, because if the SEC is driving these disclosures, I would advise my clients who are, the public companies, you should be checking with your suppliers, because you're going to need to be able to say, well, we at least checked. And that's where what you say to the suppliers matters. I think as a private entity, I'm always in the position of scaring people, and I feel terrible. The white collar lawyer, no one wants to talk to me at a cocktail party. I mean, it's it's hard to develop business. Are you a felon or thinking about committing a felony? But I think it's important to think about these things, and be prepared that it's coming. And right, I don't want to scare people thinking I've got to go get an ESG consultant, because I don't think that's true. I do think that you need to, that you just understand what the marketplace, this is where the marketplace is going. Ray raised this at the very beginning, like, the marketplace is our regulator. Well, as I said, the SEC really is taking that and is going to put their thoughts on top of that and make them the regulator of the marketplace. So I think that's why it's going to matter to private industry.
Following up on that, staying in that same vein, so I think what I would interpret both of your advice to be is check your contracts carefully. There may already be language in there that has passed some of this on to you that you weren't even aware of.
We wouldn't be prudent lawyers if we didn't say check your contracts.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. And bring them to your lawyer after you've signed them and then say, hey, can you explain to me what I agreed to? That's great for our business model, at least, but maybe not best for your interest. So you use the phrase, Marissa, a conversation, a dialogue. Ag needs to be at the table for this. Kevin, you talked about really the pushback by at least one of the commissioners saying, look, this to me looks like policy policing through SEC enforcement. On that point, is there any possibility that there is a pressure valve release on this, either politically, if different folks are in charge down the road, or even litigation wise? I mean, could it be that the litigation goes the other way and says, look, the SEC doesn't have, and particularly with this maybe more originalist Supreme Court today, this is maybe somebody does, slap SEC on the hand and say you're going too far. Is that possible? Is it possible that maybe some of the concerns are overblown, and that at the end of the day, this will even out a little bit? I'm optimistic, but you can break my heart.
I mean, I think, with 100% certainty, there's going to be lawsuits over these rules. I don't think there's any chance that this is going to just get passed and industry is going to take this laying down. And I don't mean the ag industry. I mean, oil and gas and, but a lot of people. I think that's a possibility. But I think even if the SEC's rules go away, or we spend 5 years litigating them before they're actually in effect, the practical effect of some of what they're saying is, it matters to investors. Whether there's a rule or not, it still can be material. And if it can be material to investors, a lot of what we've talked about still going to flow down to people. So I think even without the rule, which I agree with you is going to be challenged, I think a lot of this is going to stick.
Yeah, and I guess I would just add that it's not a US only conversation. And indeed, I remember one of the very first times I was asked about the Modern Slavery Act came from a client who has an investor coming out of Australia who was asking what the US is doing with respect to ethical supply chain auditing and reporting, et cetera. And my client said, what do I need to be doing, because I need to satisfy this investor who's coming from Australia, which of course they've been leagues ahead of us. You look at various markets around the world, and this is something that they've been dealing with for years, and we, to a certain extent, are a little bit slow to catch up. And so long as agriculture is a global sector with import, export, both in terms of the commodities, but also in terms of the investment dollars, which of course is part of the reality of life, I do think this is not just a US conversation. And so I think it's important to think about this in context of just where the world is going in terms of other forces.
Somebody asked a sort of a practical legal question on here about having an ESG consultant and whether there's a way to cloak that conversation in some sort of privilege. Have either of you had any experience with that? Marissa, maybe that's similar to some of the stuff you've done. Somebody wants to self-audit, but they're a little bit nervous about what the answers might be. They want to really be truthful in their own self-evaluation, and they're not really producing a document for the market yet. Is there a way to cloak that work in some sort of privilege on the inside of a company? It's a very hard question, I know.
I think the first thing to remember about privilege is an exemption from the concept that most things are discoverable. And so first off, you have to prove that you meet an exemption. And one of the exemptions includes having an attorney, so long as that report is part of the attorney's counseling that's private with the client. So this is beyond the scope of this conversation, but I do think that the first thing to think about is who is doing that audit. If it's an attorney and you've got legitimate legal advice happening through that conversation, there might be a claim for privilege but it's not automatically privileged. And so I think that's a very good question when you think, though, through that practicality. There are some ways to take a report that's prepared by a non-attorney and through a third-party attorney's review and utilization of that work product can sometimes be able to apply that exemption. But remember, privilege is an exemption from the overall concept that information is discoverable. So I think
promise we didn't plan that ahead of
my
time.
advice is talk to an attorney about that.
Marissa, great job. That is quite an answer to that question. You navigated that very carefully, and so good. One more question that came in the Q&A box, and then we'll sort of wind down unless there is another question that pops in. Again, Jenna asked, our commodities markets are, I mean, that's why we call them commodity markets in the ag space. All the corn kind of goes to one place, the wheat, the soybeans, the different small grains. So put your thinking caps on a minute. Where does this go on a bit of a large scale for our commodities markets? Do you predict that this has enough staying power, enough market power, and frankly, enough payment power to producers and to supply streams that if typically combined quantities, combined, different grades of commodities together, is there enough reward here for the ag value chain that some of that starts to break out and become more stratified or more separated? Because that's really not the way we're set up today. But do you, let's say you're advising large commercial grain dealers, is this market going to be reliable enough, this ESG premium, is it going to be reliable enough to make millions of dollars of investments to be able to separate out folks that can make the claims versus those that maybe could, but don't, or maybe couldn't? So react to that a minute on what you think maybe it means for the futures of commodity markets in the ag space.
I mean, I guess what I would say is, without getting into, getting out of my depth on the grain commodities market, what I'll say is, I think from a compliance point of view, from my point of view, an SEC compliance point of view, as long as you're accurate and about what you're saying and aren't greenwashing it, then, if you can't separate the things out, then I think you say, we do our best to identify who's compliant, but you need to know that because of the way the industry's made, we can't do that. And I think if you do that, if you say it like that, then, and it's true, and you accurately describe what you're doing to deal with that issue, then I think you're okay from an SEC point of view. From a market point of view, I don't know, Marissa, that may be more your bailiwick than mine, but.
Yeah, I think the answer is simple supply and demand in the market environment. And I don't know, to your point, Ray, whether or not there is a premium, frankly, for crops that are grown or processed within ESG framework in mind in terms of certification, et cetera. What I see happening on the practical level is that it just means that your buyer pool will shrink if you choose not to engage in this process, because what we're seeing is the consumers, the customers for the downstream, whether it's a grocery store or food processor, their customers are making these requests, their investors are making these requests, their boards are making these requests. So if they're going to be supplying agricultural product, they're going to be making those requests of the suppliers. And if you choose to not engage, it's not so much you're not going to get necessarily paid a premium. It's just that you might find that certain buyers are foreclosed to you. And that would, through the market, theoretically, I mean, I'm no economist, but would theoretically have some form of a economic pinch because you just have fewer outlets for your product. That would be my guess.
Yeah, particularly in a selling market where we have traditionally over decades had fewer and fewer buyers at the end of the day. I mean, there's certainly fewer grain buying stations, for example, across the U.S. than there would have been 20 or 30 years ago. Not necessarily because of this reason, but that could lead. What you're saying is we don't want to foreclose even any of those. So look, I think we accomplished our mission here. I mean, I don't think anyone could have listened to this conversation and your presentations without concluding, oh, here is why ESG matters to agriculture and agribusiness. And that was our goal. This is a starting place. I think we'll have more conversations about this. It's obviously a business community-wide issue, not just agriculture and agribusiness. But again, I don't think we could have had a better start than with the talent that we had on display today with the two of you. So to our participants, thank you for being with us. I hope it was valuable. I hope you'll take a moment to complete the survey. and let us know how we did and what else you'd like to hear about. I'd also point out a couple of our upcoming events on your screen. So take a look at those and follow up with us if you have questions about those. I also need to say a couple of things that are housekeeping and that I really should have done at the top. One of those is I'm just grateful for our events team at the Chamber. These events don't just happen. There are preparation calls. There are slides that have to be produced in advance. And so for both our speakers and the events team at the Chamber, I'm grateful. And then it's just on my heart to say a word about the families touched by yesterday's events, tragically, heartbreaking. And so certainly our hearts and our minds and our prayers for peace go out to them. So hard to do anything today without mentioning that and trying to look for some brighter news. When you leave, there will be a brief survey. We'd appreciate any feedback that you will offer there. Again, we will make the recording available via email over the next day or so. Thank you for being with us, and most importantly, be well, be safe, and have a good afternoon. Thanks.
Thank you, Ray.
Thank you both.